Helen Restrepo smelled the burnt aroma of coffee mixed with the damp steam rising from the Amazon River when the phone rang for the third time that morning. Her hands shook as she clutched the cracked ceramic mug, eyes fixed on the murky water stretching beyond the veranda of the small inn in Letitia. 6 years had passed since her sister Hope had vanished in those same waters, and Helen still woke every morning expecting a call that never came. Mrs. Restrepo, the voice on the other end, carried an Amazonian accent blended with something she couldn't place. "I'm Dr. Cardoso from the Manaus Institute of Biological Research. You need to come here immediately." Helen closed her eyes, feeling the world spin around her. For 6 years, she had scoured every inch of the region, interviewed riverbank villagers, hired guides, offered rewards. Her obsession with finding Hope had consumed her savings, her marriage, and her sanity. Miguel, her ex-husband, used to say she was chasing ghosts. Perhaps he was right. "What did you find?" Her voice escaped as a hoarse whisper. "I'd rather not discuss it over the phone, but we found something that belonged to your sister inside a giant caiman that fisherman killed yesterday." The phone slipped from her fingers, striking the wood floor with a hollow thud that echoed across the empty veranda. Helen felt her legs give way, the hot Amazon morning air suddenly too heavy to breathe. Hope, her younger sister, with those bright brown eyes always shining with curiosity, her contagious laughter that once filled their family home in Guadalajara on Sunday gatherings. 3 hours later, Helen stood in Dr. Cardoso's laboratory in Manaus, watching a middle-aged man with thick glasses and a blood-stained lab coat hold a small object in his gloved hands. The smell of formaldehyde and rotting flesh hung in the chilled air conditioning, making her nauseous. "Do you recognize this, Doctor?" Cardoso lifted a golden medallion, darkened with age and covered in a substance Helen preferred not to identify. Her knees nearly buckled again. It was the Our Lady of Guadalupe medal her grandmother had given Hope on her 18th birthday, the same medallion her sister never took off, not even to sleep. How do you know it was hers?" Helen could barely form the words. There was an inscription on the back, "To my dear Hope with eternal love, Grandma Rose." The caiman had been dead at least a week when the fisherman found it. But there's more. Dr. Cardoso led her to a metal table where bone fragments were arranged with surgical precision. Helen felt her world collapse as she recognized the delicate curve of a rib and a piece of skull with strands of dark hair still attached. The marks on the bones. The doctor hesitated, adjusting his glasses nervously. "They're not consistent with a caiman attack. They were made by cutting instruments, very precise ones, and there are signs the body was prepared in some way before being disposed of." Helen clutched the metal table, feeling the cold seep through her sweaty palms. "Prepared how?" "There are traces of chemical compounds on the bones, substances used in mummification or preservation processes." And Dr. Cardoso looked even more uneasy. "We also found this." He held up a small glass vial containing a yellowish liquid. "It's a blend of Amazonian plants, some known for hallucinogenic properties, others for causing temporary paralysis. It's a combination I've never seen before, but our tests suggest it would keep someone conscious yet completely immobilized." The room began to spin around Helen. She remembered the last conversation she had with Hope, 6 years ago, when her sister called from Letitia to say she had discovered a special community in the forest. "They chose me, Helen," she had said with an unnerving excitement in her voice. "I'm going to be part of something grand, something that will change everything." Helen had thought Hope referred to an environmental conservation project or anthropological research. Her sister had always been passionate about indigenous cultures and nature preservation, but now, staring at the bone fragments on the cold table, Helen realized something far more sinister lay behind those words. "Doctor, I need to know exactly where that caiman was found." Dr. Cardoso exchanged a worried look with his assistant. "Madam, Perhaps it's better to leave that to the authorities. I'm not leaving this with anyone. Helen's voice reverberated through the sterile lab. I've spent 6 years searching for my sister. 6 years. And now that I finally have a real lead, you want me to just go home and wait. The heavy silence was broken only by the humming of the air conditioner. Dr. Cardoso sighed deeply, removing his glasses to wipe them nervously. The Caiman was found near the confluence of the Soleilmoons River and a smaller tributary, about 200 kilometers upstream. There's an isolated community in that area. They call themselves the Guardians of the Sacred Serpent. They have no contact with the outside world and are extremely hostile to visitors. Helen shivered. Have you heard of them before? Only rumors. They're said to practice ancient rituals, mixing indigenous traditions with other influences. There are reports of disappearances over the years, but nothing confirmed. Local authorities prefer to stay out of it. That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She sat on the inn veranda, watching the distant lights of fishing boats drift like fireflies in the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of fish and decomposing vegetation, and occasionally she heard the distant roar of some unidentified creature from deep in the forest. At 5 that morning, she was at the Manaus market haggling with a boatman named Thomas, a sun-leathered man with suspicious eyes who had initially refused to take her to the region Dr. Cardoso had mentioned. "Madam, those people don't joke around. I've lost 2 friends who ventured there. They simply vanished," Thomas said, while checking the engine of his faded blue wooden boat. "I'll pay twice your usual rate." Thomas stopped and looked her straight in the eyes. "It's not about money, it's about survival. My sister is probably dead because of them. I need to know what happened to her." Something in Helen's voice seemed to move him, for he lowered his head and muttered something in Portuguese. She didn't understand. Then he nodded slowly. "We'll go as far as the river allows. I won't set foot on their land, and if anything goes wrong I go back alone. Understood?" The upstream journey took 8 hours. Helen sat at the bow, watching the dense jungle pass like a green, impenetrable wall on either side. Occasionally she spotted the glint of Caiman's eyes on the water's surface or heard a monkey's sharp call from the canopy, but as they advanced, even those sounds grew scarce, as if nature itself was avoiding that area. Around 3 in the afternoon, Thomas slowed the motor and pointed to a small cove on the right. "This is where my part of the deal ends, madam." Helen looked at the vegetation-covered shore. There were no signs of human habitation, only the silent, dense jungle. Then she noticed a barely visible trail, cutting through the foliage, marked by small wooden totems carved with symbols she didn't recognize. "How do I get back? If you return I'll be here tomorrow at noon. If you're not..." Thomas didn't finish the sentence. Helen grabbed her backpack, checked one last time that she had enough water and supplies, and stepped onto the muddy bank. Thomas's boat disappeared downstream in minutes, leaving her completely alone in the heart of the Amazon. The silence was deafening. Helen could hear her own breathing, her heartbeat, even the sound of her boots sinking into the damp earth as she followed the totem-marked trail. With every step the vegetation seemed to grow denser, darker, as if she were descending into some subterranean world. After 2 hours of walking, she began to hear a low, continuous hum, almost like a chant. As she drew closer, she detected human voices mixed with the beat of primitive drums. Her heart pounded faster. Then she saw the first structure, a dark wooden house covered in freshly painted red symbols. Through cracks in the walls, she saw candlelight flickering inside. Helen hid behind a massive tree and observed. People in white tunics moved between huts, carrying woven baskets and ceramic jars. Their movements were eerily coordinated, almost ritualistic. In the center of the small village stood a larger stone building from which most of the chants emanated. That's when she saw her. A woman in a white tunic passed close to her hiding spot, and Helen covered her mouth to stifle a scream. Even with longer hair and skin tanned by the Amazon sun, Helen would recognize that face anywhere. Hope was alive. Helen felt a surge of relief, confusion, and rage course through her like an electric shock. Her sister, whom she had spent 6 years searching for, who had bankrupted her family and shattered her life, was there apparently healthy and participating willingly in some kind of cult. She waited until nightfall to approach more closely. Torches around the village cast dancing shadows that aided her stealthy approach. Helen managed to reach a window of the central stone building and peered inside. What she saw made her question her own sanity. Dozens of white tunic-clad figures stood in concentric circles around a stone altar. In the center stood a tall figure, wearing an elaborate mask of bone and feathers, conducting a ritual. But that wasn't what disturbed Helen the most. Hope was on the altar, not as a participant, but as an offering. She stood motionless, eyes open yet empty of expression, while the masked man poured colored liquids over her body and chanted in a language Helen couldn't identify. Helen realized her sister was drugged, likely with the same substance Dr. Cardoso had found on the bones inside the Caiman. Hope was conscious but paralyzed, unable to move or resist what was happening. Then Helen understood the terrible truth. The bones in the Caiman weren't Hope's. They belonged to another victim, someone who had undergone the same ritual before her sister, and from the medallion fragments found, someone had planted evidence to make her believe Hope was dead. But why? The answer came in the form of a heavy hand on her shoulder. Helen Restrepo. A voice whispered in her ear. You finally came to find us. Helen turned slowly and faced a pale-skinned man with ice-blue eyes, clearly not native to the region. He wore the same white tunic as the others, yet exuded authority. Who are you? Helen tried to keep her voice steady, though her legs quivered. My name is Marcus. I am, let's say, the spiritual leader of this community, and you are exactly what we were waiting for. Waiting. Marcus smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. Your sister spoke of you often, about your devotion, your determination, your willingness to sacrifice everything for those you love. Very valuable qualities. Helen tried to run, but 2 more figures blocked her escape. What do you want? Hope volunteered for our sacred ritual 6 years ago, but we discovered the power of the sacrifice is stronger when true love is involved. Sisters, mothers, daughters, the blood bond intensifies the spiritual energy released during the ceremony. Helen's stomach twisted. You're mad. We are devoted. We follow a tradition much older than any modern religion. The sacred serpent demands specific offerings to grant us its gifts. And you, dear Helen, are the final piece we need to complete your sister's ritual. Then Helen realized she'd been deceived from the start. Dr. Cardoso, the phone call, the bones in the Caiman, all an elaborate ruse to lure her here. Hope had indeed joined the cult voluntarily, but somehow they learned of Helen and decided she would be the final ingredient for their macabre ceremony. Hope would never agree to this, Helen said, trying to buy time as she searched for a way out. Your sister is beyond agreeing or refusing. She's been under our special preparations for 3 years. Her mind belongs to the serpent now. But don't worry, you two will be together forever. Marcus signaled to the others, who advanced on Helen. She tried to flee, but one of the substances Dr. Cardoso mentioned was already taking effect. Someone had spiked her water during the boat journey. Her legs would not obey her brain's commands. As Helen's consciousness began to fade, she heard Marcus whisper, Dr. Cardoso sends his regards too. He's been very helpful in attracting suitable individuals to our community. Helen awoke tied to the same altar where she had seen Hope. Her sister stood beside her, still with that empty expression, but Helen saw a single tear roll down Hope's cheek. Deep somewhere, Hope was conscious and suffering. The ceremony had begun. Marcus, now wearing an even more elaborate mask, raised a ceremonial knife, while dozens chanting voices swelled around them. Helen tried to move, to shout, to do anything, but the drugs kept her body completely paralyzed. Then she heard a sound that shouldn't be there. The roar of boat engines. Marcus halted mid-incantation, turning toward the river. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by shouts of confusion and panic. Bright lights illuminated the village, and Helen heard commands in Portuguese. Federal police, hands in the air. What Helen didn't know was that Dr. Cardoso was real, but unaffiliated with the cult. When he didn't receive her call back, he alerted the authorities. Thomas, the boatman, had also reported her location to local officials when she failed to return to the agreed meeting point. In the chaos that followed, Helen saw Marcus try to stab her, but a sniper's bullet struck his chest before he could complete the strike. He collapsed onto the altar, his blood merging with the ceremonial liquids he had poured moments before. Helen spent 3 weeks in a Manaus hospital, recovering from the drug effects and processing everything that had happened. Hope was in the next room, slowly being cleansed of the substances that had controlled her mind for years. The investigation revealed that the guardians of the sacred serpent were actually an international cult led by Marcus Heinrich, a former German chemist wanted by Interpol for a series of disappearances in multiple countries. They used a blend of synthetic drugs and Amazonian plants to control victims, keeping them in a state of permanent semi-consciousness. Dr. Cardoso had truly found the bones in the Cayman, but they belonged to a Dutch tourist who had gone missing 2 years earlier. Hope's medallion had been planted by cult members as part of their scheme to lure Helen, but Hope's recovery would be slow and complex. When she finally spoke coherently, 3 weeks after the rescue, her first words to Helen were, "I knew you would come, even when they put those things in my food, even when I couldn't think straight, I knew you wouldn't stop looking for me." Helen held her sister's hand, feeling the rough textured skin tanned by the Amazon sun. "Why did you go with them, Hope? Why didn't you tell me what was really happening?" Hope closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. "At first I thought they were different." Marcus spoke of preserving ancient traditions, of connecting with nature on a deeper level. He seemed so convincing. "And I was going through a difficult time after my divorce, but you must have realized something was wrong. When I realized, it was too late. They started spiking my food, my water. I became confused. I forgot things, and gradually, I couldn't even think of escaping. It was as if my brain couldn't form the thought of leaving." Helen felt a mix of anger and compassion. Part of her wanted to scold Hope for being so naive, for causing years of agony for their family, but looking at her sister's fragile expression, she understood that Hope had been as much a victim as anyone Marcus had captured. "The doctors say you'll fully recover," Helen said, squeezing her sister's hand. "It will take time, but you'll be all right. And you? How are you handling all this?" Helen paused for a long moment. For 6 years, her life had revolved entirely around finding Hope. She had lost her marriage, her career, her financial stability. She had become obsessed, allowing the search to consume everything she was. But now, sitting in this sterile hospital room, holding my sister's hand, hearing the sounds of normal life outside, cars passing, people talking, children playing, I realize I need to learn to live again. It was Hope who suggested they return home together, to Guadalajara, where they could support each other during recovery. Helen hesitated at first. Her life in Mexico had collapsed years ago, and she didn't know if she had the courage to face the people she had left behind in her desperate search. But as days passed in the hospital, watching Hope struggle to regain fragments of her former self, Helen understood that her sister needed her just as much as she had needed Hope during those years of searching. They returned to Guadalajara on a rainy December morning, 6 months after the rescue. Their childhood home still stood, cared for by distant cousins who never lost hope that the Restrepo sisters would one day return. Helen found work as a translator using the language skills she had developed during her travels throughout South America. Hope began intensive therapy to cope with the trauma and long-term effects of the drugs she had consumed for years. Some nights, Helen still woke in a panic, thinking it had all been a dream and that Hope was still lost somewhere in the Amazon. Other times, it was Hope who awoke screaming, reliving distorted fragments of memories from the rituals she had witnessed or unwittingly participated in. But gradually, they learned to build a new normal together. Helen never spoke publicly about her Amazon experience, but she occasionally received calls from other families who had lost loved ones under similar circumstances. She always offered support and resources, but never promised miracles. She had learned that not all stories have happy endings, and not all lost people can be found. On a hot June afternoon, 1 year after the rescue, Helen sat in her Guadalajara garden, watching Hope plant flowers in a bed she had prepared for native Mexican species. Her sister still spoke slowly at times, and there were moments when she seemed lost in distant thoughts, but she was there. Alive, real. Helen, Hope looked up from the flower bed, dark soil on her hands. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had stopped searching for me? Helen considered the question carefully. In therapy, she had explored that possibility many times. If she had given up after 2 or 3 years, if she had accepted Hope was dead and tried to move on, sometimes, she admitted, but then I remember, I couldn't have lived with myself if I hadn't tried everything, even knowing all the suffering it caused, your marriage, your career. Miguel wasn't the right man for me, if he couldn't understand why I needed to find you, and as for work, well, you can always find new work. Hope smiled, a genuine smile Helen hadn't seen in over 7 years. Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself. As the sun set over Guadalajara, painting the sky in orange and purple hues, Helen felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The obsession that had consumed years of her life had transformed into something else, not the desperate need to find something lost, but a quiet gratitude for having retrieved what mattered most. She knew that both she and Hope would carry the scars of that experience forever. The sleepless nights, the flashbacks, the distrust of strangers, the constant need to know where the other was. But they had survived the worst life had thrown at them, and that meant they could survive anything. That night, as Helen prepared for sleep, she found a letter on her nightstand, one Hope had left for her. In trembling but determined handwriting, her sister had written, "Helen, there are not enough words to thank you for what you did for me. But I want you to know that during all those years in the forest, even when my mind was clouded, there was a part of me that never doubted you would come. Your love was the anchor that kept me connected to the real world, even when I couldn't remember who I was. Now it's my turn to help you find yourself without the search that defined your life for so long. Let's discover that together." Helen folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer, next to an old photo of the two sisters, taken on a family Sunday before everything fell apart. In the picture, they were laughing, embraced, completely unaware of the trials ahead. But looking at the photo now, Helen didn't feel sad for what they had lost. She felt grateful for what they had found again. Not only each other, but a deeper understanding of love's limits, determination, and the human capacity to survive the unimaginable. From the next room, she could hear Hope breathing deeply, finally sleeping in peace. And for the first time in 6 years, Helen also slept without dreaming of dark waters and distant cries echoing through the Amazon.